Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss Geert Wilders' win in the Netherlands, debates in the labor movement over Israel and Gaza, and budget cuts in New York City. I'm joined by Saraba Mari, Nina Power, and Jeff Schulenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. As we record on Compact, we've published an article, Geert Wilders Will Disappoint You. Apologize in advance for our Dutch listeners who criticize my pronunciation of the name. The author of the article, J.A. Koster, lays out, I think, one of the best analyses of the Wilders phenomenon that I've seen. He talks about how Wilders' recent parliamentary victory indicates kind of double movement in Dutch politics. Parties that were previously more straightforwardly neoliberal have moved to the left on economics in response to a huge cost of living crisis in the Netherlands, a lack of housing, real pressure on people, in part because of green policies dealing with carbon. And then also parties have moved to the right, as he puts it, on migration and cultural issues in response to a large influx of migrants. So Geert Wilders, who was a somewhat more lonely voice on those issues a couple decades ago, along with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, has not really arrived at the center of politics. There's more to Koster's piece. Geert Wilders Will Disappoint You. Have any of you been following this, and what do you make of Wilders' rise?
I think we have to say that, like you said, at the economic context, I think some of the specific issues that have been happening in the Netherlands that are laid out very well in the article also include kind of big farmers' protest around various issues to do with nitrogen and the kind of clash of the reality between what it is to actually work on the land and nature itself and what it actually takes to farm, and these kind of deranged green imperatives that are coming from the top. And, as we've seen, the left are not so interested anymore often in genuine workers' struggles. Obviously, we've tried to cover some of these protests and these movements, but I think they're definitely having an impact. I would say in the broader European context, we've also got I think that the needle has shifted quite quickly, actually, in the last few weeks on the question of immigration. Even the sort of formally, basically de facto open borders Tory government in the UK are now saying, oh dear, maybe we should look at this issue again after sacking Suella Braverman, partly for mentioning it. I think that's also tied in somehow to the Israel-Palestine conflict and the kind of resistance among native populations or older populations in particular nations reacting to perceived, division really between support for Israel and support for Palestine, which has been playing out in the streets of many European and other countries. So they're very heady times. I mean, we're talking in general about populist movements. Obviously, we've seen Millet, we've seen Wilders. They all have silly hair. Boris Johnson had silly hair. Anyway, let's just note that, move on. I think, there is a kind of crisis of identity of nations. There's a crisis of leadership. One of the really, really striking problems or questions that's raised by Wilders, as mentioned in Costa's piece, is really the limits of democracy. So if the other parties refuse to work with Wilders because they don't like his politics or they don't like him, even though he has more votes and indeed should be looking to form a coalition because that's how proportional representation is going to work. You have a really pressing question about the nature of democracy itself, insofar as when the people vote for somebody that other people in power don't want, what are you going to do? You're going to engage in really quite anti-democratic behaviour in order to quote unquote preserve democracy. And we know what the precedent for this behaviour is in the mid-20th century, and people are still forever invoking this mid-20th century moment as the transcendental condition of possibility for all politics, apparently, in the world. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see if he can manage to convince people to actually work with him. But I think we have to say the people have spoken in this instance on a variety of issues, and they're not unreasonable to do so.
My political coming of age was so bound up with the kind of post 9/11 moment that Wilders and Ayaan Hirsi Ali represented, those debates of the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 era of how Islam fits in Western societies, specifically in Europe. Wilders taking, the hard line that unassimilated Muslim populations pose a security and a kind of ideological threat to European societies. What was always very clear to me, and it's why a figure like Wilders is hard to box in as far right the way that much of the mainstream media does, is that at the time, Wilders and some of the people who were his supporters in the United States and in Britain, it saw themselves as the sort of tip of the spear of liberal democracy. That is, that Wilders was the representative of this idea of liberalism as committed absolutely to free expression, committed absolutely to individual freedom, and that was not compatible with Islam. And where the ummah spreads, it brings its sort of social mores, which are not conducive to free expression. So it was always about these debates of, for example, depictions of the Prophet Muhammad in various satirical magazines across Europe, of the filmmaker Theo van Gogh, who was murdered by an Islamist because he made he's a Dutch filmmaker. He made a movie that was critical of Islam's treatment of women. That was actually, Ayaan Hirsi Ali was involved with that. It's very interesting that, to me, these contradictions of Wilders, that he is, in fact, actually he's a radical liberal Democrat in some ways. And so in defense of liberal democracy, he would do away with, the rights of Muslims in Dutch society to express themselves and go to the mosque, et cetera, or go to Islamic schools. But he doesn't see that as an illiberal action. He sees it as, and I think sincerely, as a defense of democracy, of liberalism and democracy against the social force Islam that if given too much space to, will make impossible, the liberal project. And, to be honest, that is not a crazy idea. Right. In a way, I think it's sensible to a lot of people when they, for example, see cartoonists and filmmakers in Europe threatened and then cowed into silence, into not depicting what they would otherwise depict. His brand of secularism is not my brand, but reception of Geert Wilders, of what he's categorized as on the political spectrum, is a very interesting and complicated question. I think Koster's essay is very good because he notes also that Wilders is in many ways an old-fashioned social democrat when it comes to economic issues. He wants to raise wages. He wants to increase health benefits. He wants to lower the retirement age, as Marine Le Pen does in many ways. And that raises the question of what is social democracy, right? Is in some ways, it suggests that social democracy is a more conservative project than the people who would explicitly champion it would think. And I think this is the really sort of discomfiting point at the heart of J.A. Koster's essay for us. You should really read the whole thing. That we've had a bonanza of new subscriptions over the past few days. This piece happens to be not paywalled, but you should subscribe to get access to all of it. The headline is, Geert Wilders will disappoint you.
In other news, Saurabh, I know you've been following this story closely. The American labor movement, very important labor organizations, have been torn by debates over the attacks launched by Hamas against Israel and now Israel's response in Gaza. I think it might be surprising to some people. Labor unions find it necessary to weigh in on conflict in the Middle East. I don't know, maybe not so surprising to others. What's going on there?
I think this is part of a broader shift in the American labor movement in terms of how it relates to the American left, and specifically the Democratic Party and its kind of professional managerial apparatus, whose views on Israel are changing, and as are their views on things are on reproductive rights or abortion, on transgender issues, et cetera, et cetera. The kind of professional core of the Democratic Party is becoming very liberal and critical of Israel as well. Like, you've seen how Democratic staffers in Congress have been releasing these statements, essentially disagreeing with their ostensible bosses, the actual members of Congress, on what the response to the October 7th attacks should be. That's just one. The Israel question is just one dimension of this broader shift of the young professional core of the Democratic Party. And the labor movement, because it's become an appendage of the Democratic Party rather than being an independent movement that stands in a kind of equidistant way between the two parties, has to go along with whatever it is that is in vogue on the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. So many labor organizations now take quite an extreme stance relative to the American population at large on reproductive issues. But I would say not just relative to the American population at large, but relative to their own membership, especially in the kind of traditional manufacturing industries, Teamsters, carpenters, electricians, and stuff who are members of these unions. Their views on abortion, span a range, right? Some can be quite conservative on those issues. Some are more kind of moderate Democrat position on abortion, but the Democratic Party, its professional apparatus, is on the left. And so the kind of leadership at these institutions has to move along as well. Why has this happened? Well, my thesis, and I think it's one shared by our friend Michael Lind, is that it's because the Republican Party has given the Labor the back of the hand for the better part of 2 generations. There's no dialogue there. There's no way of making headway there. So you better make do with whatever party that is willing to at least give you crumbs, and that happens to be the Democrats. That's bad for the labor movement because it denies them their independence, which is, I think, paramount to a really successful labor movement. But it's also bad for both parties, in the sense that they don't have to compete for the labor vote in a serious way. Republicans especially, are now bringing in an influx of working class voters. Beginning since 2016, they've brought in these working class voters. They don't have an agenda, for whom they don't have an answer. And it's in part because labor is not an organized constituency within the Republican Party. And it won't be as long as, labor as seen by many lawmakers, not unjustly on the right, as kind of a tool of the left wing of the Democratic Party. So it's a very difficult dynamic to break, and it's a kind of chicken and egg dynamic. Like, what do you blame? Well, whichever side you blame, whether you blame labor's actions or the Republican Party, it's not going to solve the problem. So it's a matter of both sides taking productive steps. One way to do that, for example, would be, this is an issue that is at the top of the mind of a lot of Republican populists who want to be pro-labor, is the congressional scorecards that labor organizations use to rank, or sort of score how well they do in responding to labor's issues. And one complaint that a lot of our friends on the populist wing of the GOP have is that the categories used to rank lawmakers go far beyond like typical labor issues. It's like how supportive you are of quote unquote democracy, which translates really into how opposed you are to like Trumpism, or all sorts of cultural issues like gender and stuff that had nothing to do with whether or not you support collective bargaining. So that might be a small kind of step that each side can take toward the other, would be to like revise those and just try to focus scoring lawmakers not on things that have nothing to do with labor in a strict sense, but are more about kind of the cultural politics of the left.
In the New York City public defenders, for people unfamiliar or outside the U.S., these are attorneys who are provided to indigent clients who can't afford any other legal representation by the city. And it's sort of a convoluted operation. Many of them are sort of independent nonprofits subcontracted by the city. In any case, these are, so these attorneys have unions that represent them. These are white collar labor unions. There's been a great deal of growth of white collar labor unions in the past. In fact, it's been one of the main growth areas of the labor movement. It does raise certain problems. And I think it converges with this way that the labor unions have become sort of clients of the Democratic Party. But it also means that they've become kind of integrated with and representative of kind of, broader white sort of, professional class social values and social movements. And so in any case, these public defender unions basically wanted to vote on and issue statements, condemning the bombardment of Gaza. And then, there were actually lawsuits brought against them, which blocked these votes from happening. And then there were also, because some of these are nonprofits that are subcontracted from the government, they are reliant on donors. So there were also donors who intervened and didn't want, essentially the attorneys employed by these nonprofits that they donate to issue these statements. And, it seems like, and if you look at much of the coverage of this has been in left-wing media like The Intercept, or it's sort of been condemned as more McCarthyism and so on. But to me, the bigger question is, what value is there in union representing public defenders in like the Bronx weighing in on what's happening in Gaza, it seems clear that they have no meaningful leverage on the issue or sort of relationship to it. Whatever the function of this union is, it doesn't seem clear to me how it has any relevance to what's going on in the Middle East. But I think the answer is that there's been a slippage of these unions away from functioning primarily as collective bargaining units for employees and towards these other goals. And, I think in some ways that is indicative of their weakness as well, because, and I'll say this from within, having sort of been in the white collar union realm in academia, you'll actually hear people say things like this more or less explicitly, right? That like, well, you can't really get like that many great improvements in your material situation. I mean, you can get some, but hey, you can, use this to kind of pursue all of these other political goals. And so it interestingly functions as this kind of compensatory thing for, people who, and I think it's partly that white collar workers still have quite a bit of trouble conceiving of themselves in the way that sort of traditional members of collective bargaining units would have, right? As like people with concrete material self-interest, because they operate professionally in the realm of the symbolic and abstract, perhaps. But there's also just the fact that these are people of a class that has experienced sort of diminishing returns. One possibility is that they unionize in an attempt to remedy that, but there are also limits on what that can achieve just through the very structure of the whole system. And the result is that they may instead sort of compensate for those, material frustrations by seeking these kind of more abstract political goals, if that makes sense. So one thing that I thought was interesting is, a statement from one of the members of this public defender union, which was unions must act where the U.S. government will not. So this was explaining why unions, why this union, this public defender attorneys union should make a statement about Gaza, right? Unions should act where the government should not. Kind of an odd statement. It's unclear what this action, which is really just a statement, will achieve. So, but then the other thing that's kind of interesting here is that, that there is a kind of rationality to this, going back to Saurabh's points, which is that these are elements of the Democratic Party sort of civil society organism. And therefore, part of the way they're functioning here is just as pressure groups within the Democratic Party coalition. And that this means, or it illustrates the way that they're not entirely functioning in the way that we would have traditionally expected unions to. And that this creates also a kind of feedback loop, which ties their fortunes ever more to those of the Democratic Party and weakens their independence or ability to actually exercise any influence outside of the sort of internal workings of the party system.
We've definitely seen a similar slide in unions over here. I think the sort of very small percentage of people who are actually member of unions, or increasingly smaller numbers, also tend to be the most politicized people. So we've seen massive ultra-leftist drift in, for example, the University College Union in the UK, which is actually at odds really with the politics of most of its members. But you have this kind of sort of extreme leadership promoting or pushing, let's say, the sort of at the frontier of social justice issues, and actually sort of not standing up, therefore, for its members, particularly when they're being kind of cancelled, losing their jobs, which you would think a union would fight for its members over. But because the ideology is seeped in everywhere, and a particular extreme form of the ideology, that the unions are basically in some ways attacking themselves, like you say, particularly the white collar ones. And it goes alongside what I was trying to write about the other week with the kind of art forum and institutional pressure on institutions to have a political position on pretty much every issue, regardless of what the institution itself is ostensibly supposed to stand for. So you have this kind of, really excessive amniotic politicization of institutions and a turning away from bread and butter and everyday issues, and including turning away from their own members, which has to be completely counterproductive. It's like a death spiral for a union.
In New York, huge budget crisis. Eric Adams, the city's mayor, is facing. He announced in November that the city would cut several kind of key services, a massive reduction in the police force. The next 5 classes at the police academy are canceled. The number of New York cops is expected to fall below 30,000 for the first time since the 1980s. Adams will also slash the education department budget by $1 billion over 2 years. We'll see cuts to some very popular programs like universal pre-K summer classes, which help a lot of working parents basically get free childcare. Also, New York's public libraries are going to face the brunt of it. They won't be open on Sundays any longer. There are a bunch of things behind this crisis. One is just a big staffing up that occurred under Adams's predecessor, Bill de Blasio, more city workers of various kinds, and also higher salaries for many of those workers. The bill for that is coming due. And then the other issue is the arrival of more than 130,000 migrants in New York since the spring of 2022. New York works under a 4-decade-old legal arrangement called right to shelter that courts have imposed on the city during the mayoralty of Ed Koch. Basically, any person in New York who's homeless has a right to a home, and the city must find him a place of shelter. Most famously, this has meant that the city has arranged kind of opaque no-bid contracts with hotel companies, putting migrants in hotels. Something has contributed to a decline in tourism in New York because tourists have heard of this and wonder, well, how can I find, will my hotel be a migrant hotel? Will it not be? Increases uncertainty. And then there are other forms of shelters that have been found for the migrants. The costs of this are enormous, running into the billions. Adams has said it will bankrupt the city. The arrival of these migrants. Adams won by campaigning against the defund the police movement. He has now announced a massive defunding of the police, which is arriving not directly because of a kind of anarchist opposition to policing and security, but because of some very harsh budget realities that the city is facing because of some bad choices it made and some dubious legal arrangements it labors under. I don't know who's feeling hopeful. Where's the silver lining here? Is New York doomed once again?
It seems clear that he's really been rhetorically leaning on this as the thing that is creating the problem. I imagine there's quite a bit more to it. It's a very complex budgetary system. And, Matthew spoke to some of the other factors. I mean, it is worth noting, the commercial real estate occupancy rate is still only 50% of what it was before the pandemic lockdowns. And if you look at the coverage of this is celebrated, right, as like, whoa, we're back, but it's still 50%. I mean, that's a pretty remarkable decline.
In Midtown, you can look at buildings, and because it's all clear glass, you can see just whole buildings that are empty. Maybe the landlords are looking for tenants that will occupy the entire building, right? They could maybe rent it out to less desirable tenants. But yeah, they're just complete, huge buildings that are empty.
I mean, there are a lot of things that are odd here, in part because the sort of tax breaks, the whole complicated system of tax breaks that was created to incentivize things like the construction of Hudson Yards, and basically throughout the past 15 years created this kind of glut of high-end real estate, both commercial and residential, so that there's a huge amount of revenue not being collected there, right? Because these tax breaks were created, and also because a lot of these buildings are standing empty. Just the sheer insanity of lockdown and remote work for a city like New York, where it's essentially it just destroys the sort of lifeblood of the city. And so, it seems obvious that there's kind of a prolonged hangover from that set of disasters, compounded by the missing federal aid. And then, this migrant thing, I will only say it's very strange because I moved recently within Brooklyn. Both areas were seeing a considerable influx of migrants. Interestingly, the ones in the area I'm living now seem to be almost entirely African. They seem to be basically just kind of hustling and trying to figure out how to make a living, as far as I can observe. A lot of them are like collecting bottles and cans. There's a big bottle and can redemption site right downstairs from where I live. So you see them out there lined up with like bags and bags of bottles and cans. These are all like young men. Michael Lind covered this in a piece called the Sanctuary City Ponzi Scheme, where he basically argued that the whole model of these large expensive metropoli is partly to have a constant influx of cheap labor. Clearly these guys are willing to hustle. They're willing to do what needs to be done to survive. So it's true on one hand that they require a great deal of funding, which is not being provided by the federal government, which is draining the New York City budget. But there is kind of an element in which, okay, these guys are hungry. They want to make it here, and they do seem to be and they're like mostly kind of strong working age men. So clearly, there's some sort of way that the economy of the city has benefited from this kind of influx of cheap labor, in the sense of like, and I don't mean the economy for average people necessarily. I mean, the whole kind of extremely unhealthy and unequal economy is dependent on this, as Lind argues, to kind of keep it going. It reminds me a bit of what Angela Nagel wrote about in Ireland, that it's like, and not because there have been any horrible incidents that I'm aware of in New York, but just because it's kind of this like big phenomenon you see, but nobody seems to know how to talk about it or what sense to make of what's going on. Adams himself is kind of now in this bizarre scandal involving supposed sort of Turkish influence, some kind of Turkish influence campaign, which sort of targeted him.
Matthew mentioned one of Mayor Adams's venerable predecessors, Ed Koch, after whom the Ed Koch Queensboro Bridge, which I take all the time, is named. And one of Ed Koch's favorite sayings was, he was known for saying really kind of colorful, kind of obscene things. Like one of them was, do you want me to tell you the truth or to stroke you? In this case, Matthew asked, to what extent is this a matter of Adams shifting blame to migrants for larger structural problems? As between Adams and his critics in the city council and and elsewhere in the city bureaucracy who are much more progressive, I'm 100% with Team Adams, because he's been quite sensible about what this wave of migrants has meant for cities in the Northeast, including New York City. He's gone to the border. He's published public messages to the migrants, translated to Spanish, saying, "Don't come to New York. Life will be very hard for you," etc. But he's still a Democratic loyalist to the extent that he's still gotten heat for this, but he's actually been quite loyal in the sense that he hasn't made the question about the underlying policy at the border, which has allowed this kind of enormous flux of illegal migrants, most of whom are coming in as asylum seekers, even though they really aren't refugees in the classical legal understanding of that term. They're economic migrants coming from desperate places. This is a Biden administration policy, having done away with the Trump model of you have to apply where you are or remain in Mexico for asylum. And then if you are deemed to be in fact a refugee, then you'll be admitted. This is a Biden policy. I think it's one of Biden's biggest mistakes. I'll say this as someone who admires some of the stuff he's done around like industrial policy and other things. Mayor Adams hasn't been willing to call out the underlying policy. It's funny because he's seen as this terrible far right figure among some New York City Democrats because he's even willing to raise the kind of costs of migration as an issue. But in fact, he hasn't questioned the underlying policy. All that he and other Democratic mayors have told the Biden administration is, fine if you want to let everyone in, but you got to fund us to be able to support these people.
There's a kind of recognition that, this is part of what kind of keeps the whole deeply unequal big city economy kind of humming along, is having this type of influx. They just want somebody else to underwrite the costs of it.
Yes. So we want our Deliveroo drivers who are totally exploited and have no protections because they're illegal and they get run over by cars, as they frequently do. They have no recourse. We want our, transit to have riders. We want our public service agencies to have clients, et cetera, is Lynn's point. But yeah, he won't say it. And I think, to go back to Koch, do you want me to tell you the truth or to stroke you? In the spirit of Koch, I think the thing Adams should do for the good of the country, because it would mean a lot if he said it, is to call out the underlying policy rather than merely complain about the uncosted expenses and say, hey, we need like 40 billion if you want us to do this every year. That's it. I mean, that's the way that these people are put up. It's no way to live. I mean, they're in these camps, etc., hyper exploitable. It's bad for them. It's bad for the country as a whole. It stokes like right-wing reaction, I think justifiably. So I just wish Adams would be a little bit bolder, if anything. I mean, he's really, really hated by progressives in New York City. Like, they despise him. So if they despise him anyway, why not just go all the way? But for maybe Lynn's point, which is that he doesn't mind the migrants. He just wants it to be like he wants taxpayers in Iowa or elsewhere to help foot the bill for the externalities they impose on the city and the costs.
When Eric Adams was the Brooklyn Borough president, he gave a speech at a Martin Luther King Day event. He said, go back to Iowa, you go back to Ohio, at this speech in Harlem. And then he continued, New York City belongs to the people that was here and made New York what it is. So it's an expression of a kind of New York nationalism, basically saying, get your gentrifying white heinies back to the heartland. Take your, Wellesley degrees, your Michigan man hats, and get the heck out of my city. This belongs to the people we here. This is our town. Very different from the rhetoric he uses about migrants. He would not ever go there talking about the West Africans I see on the street carrying bags from the city's agencies that deal with migrants. He wouldn't use that rhetoric about Guatemalans who are being bussed up here. The Iowans, and as a Nebraskan, I have some sympathy with his hatred of them, but he wants them out of here.
Have this like go back where you came from, and this kind of we don't want your people in this part of town kind of attitude. Although weirdly, a lot of the people who that is most appealing to are themselves, in my experience, are themselves sort of gentrifiers. They're like, it's like the people who arrived 5 years ago are annoyed about the people who are competing with them, who arrived last year, or competing with them for real estate. But it's a particularly silly but persistent dimension of sort of left-leaning politics here. And, I think you wouldn't hear Adams say that in a speech, directed at the whole city, right? He would say it in particular contexts where it would kind of be a particular kind of rabble-rousing, particular sort of nativism and populism you're allowed to indulge in.
Yeah. So, well, as long as we don't have buses of people coming in from Amana, Iowa, or spring breakers straight from Lake Okoboji or something, I guess we'll keep welcoming the migrants here in New York. With that, thanks, Sarab, Nina, and Jeff. Thanks to you listeners. Go to compactmag.com/subscribe. Some really great stuff. Angela Nagel on the riots in Ireland. We mentioned Koster on, and I'm told it's Geert Wilders. I have to mispronounce the Dutch words if I mispronounce Iran, Sarab. So I try to even out the mispronunciations. But compactmag.com/subscribe.